Support for the Living Wisdom podcast is provided by InTouch Pharmaceuticals, committed to meeting the specialized pharmaceutical needs of their clients. Visit intouchpharma.com to learn more. Well, thank you so much for joining us for another Living Wisdom session.
Yeah.
We have covered so much already, but we have so much more to go. I'm Karsten, alongside Deb Carriveau. What I've loved that we've been doing is going over all the stages of dementia, and really taking a deep dive into what every single experience is going to be like for caregivers.
Because it really is different at
Yeah.
each progression level, each stage as people are moving through this journey. Each one has its own individual challenges.
Yeah, it's really interesting
Yeah.
to learn more about. We're now on the late stage, and you and I were chatting. This is kind of the shortest time spent in this stage. Why is that?
So it's just as people progress through this disease process, this is kind of, we refer to it as, kind of where the sidewalk ends. This is kind of the end process for people who are living with this disease. And it's kind of when we start to see body functions start to shut down. And so typically when people get to this piece of the process, it tends to be shorter, although as a caregiver, sometimes it can feel like it's the longest process because it's kind of this journey of perpetual grief, and you're kind of coming to the end piece where now physically people start to be impacted more.
I'll let you pick that up because that's an okay cut, right, Kelsey?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Nope, you're good.
You're fine. So just be looking at each other once you start back. Yeah,
Okay.
so that's
Okay.
your shot.
So very similar to the other stages that we've done, we're going to break this down the exact same way. So we're starting with characteristics, and again, we're talking late stage. So what are some of the characteristics?
So one of the things that happens is as people get to this part of the journey, it will help caregivers to kind of think about what you see and experience with toddlers. All right, it's kind of, that's the level they're at when they're processing and reacting and engaging in their environment. So characteristically, they become individuals who are frightened very easily, have a lot of anxiety, they have a lot of fear of being abandoned if you're out of their sight. Frequently, they feel like that means you're gone and you're not coming back. The other thing that happens is they become very unstable with emotional swings. You will see a lot of roller coastering of emotions because they're having more and more difficulty processing what they experience. They become very literal thinkers, so everything's very black and white. If you say, oh, it's time for us to jump into bed, that's literally how they're going to react. So as a caregiver, you have to be very conscious at this point in time about how you say things, what words you use, because they become very black and white, very literal thinkers. Movement becomes kind of a self-comforting kind of thing, very much like experiencing what you experience as a parent if you've ever had a colicky baby. Movement is comforting. So they do a lot of wandering, pacing, rocking, those kinds of physical movements because they create this self-comfort process for people.
Interesting. And that's going to be really hard because with this going on, these individuals have been out of the toddler stage for a long time. They're not even used to
That's correct.
necessarily thinking like that. Is this also the point in time where you have more issues with wandering?
Yes.
Okay, because I was thinking.
So a secured environment is
Okay.
very important. If your loved one at this end of the process is still very physically mobile, then secure exits becomes a big concern because these people will go anywhere at any time that the impulse strikes them. They have no awareness at this level in terms of how they put themselves at risk or what even a risk might look like for them. So they just impulsively will move. So making sure your doors are secured, that they can't unlock exits, that they can't get outdoors independently. becomes a huge concern.
Okay, you said if mobile. Are there a lot of cases that they aren't
So
mobile?
the other thing that is a potential at this level is that because people do start to experience more of a neurological decline that impacts physical things, they also may at this point in time be immobile and be wheelchair bound, or particularly as they advance, bed bound.
Yeah.
So the security is an issue when they remain mobile, but oftentimes at this point in time, people may not be mobile.
No, that just actually sparked a question. If they are bound to the bed, is there a struggle with helping them understand that they are bound? Is there a disconnect? Do they think that they can still move around, but they can't?
Yes, so that can be a potential risk.
Okay.
It just depends on physically how intact their body movements are and their ability to make themselves move. Oftentimes when we talk about someone being bedbound, it means that they don't have the physical capability to move again or independently make movement happen for themselves.
So those are characteristics. What are some communication challenges during this stage?
So frequently at this point in time on the journey, people are starting to really struggle with any kind of verbalization, any kind of verbal communication that necessarily is relevant or makes sense to the caregiver. So frequently we may be dealing with people being able to continue to speak words, but will develop what we call word salad, which feels to the caregiver like somebody just throws a bunch of words in a bowl,
Right.
tosses them up and throws them out. So
Right.
they don't necessarily use words in sequences or statements that make sense. Also at this point in time, it's not unusual for people to just lose verbalization skills altogether and just may communicate through nonsensical sounds.
Again, bringing you back to that toddler stage, right? I'm envisioning my toddler trying to talk to me. We talk a lot about the caregivers and how to help them. Is this incredibly frustrating for the individual with dementia at this point?
It is, exactly, because frequently they have in their heads what they want to communicate, but struggle not being able to get those thoughts into words and communicate that. It's one of the reasons why at this point in time, a lot of what we see in terms of their attempt to communicate is going to be relayed through behavior because they're not able necessarily to verbalize their thoughts. And when we as caregivers are struggling to understand, that increases their level of frustration.
Yeah.
And sometimes the only way they know to make themselves heard or what feels like making themselves clear to us is they will act it out.
I'm thinking of the caregiver and patient kind of scenario here. So they, in their head, know what they're trying to say. They can't verbalize it. I'm assuming that brings some frustration and then in turn almost brings some fear because it's kind of, they remember themselves as being able to speak.
Right.
So then is this just another layer to the caregiver to have to constantly say, you know, you're okay, like how would you as a caregiver approach that? Is it a constant, let me try to explain to you what's happening, you're okay, I'm here for you, or what happens?
So again, because these individuals at this level are frightened very easily and anxiety is a big like constant companion for them. So it does, on the caregiver part, require a lot of reassurance, just, you know, just kind of that loving, slow-paced, patient kind of interaction. But even beyond that, one of the things we recommend to caregivers is at this stage, hopefully all along in this process, caregivers have paid attention to the nonverbal communication that their loved one displays. Because when you get to this point in time and people have lost their verbal skills, it's trying to read body language, read facial expression, read emotions behind the communication. So even though the words may be nonsensical, what you're trying to do is gauge what is the feeling or emotion behind that. So for example, if I'm a loved one that you have that is a late stage person and I'm trying to communicate to you something I'm experiencing, you might experience something with me that's So even though my verbalization is nonsensical, do you get the emotion
like you're not
of
happy.
feeling right?
That's for sure. Yeah.
So as a caregiver, it's about responding and acknowledging what that feeling is that I'm having behind the communication, because what I think I'm communicating might not even be in real time or really exist, but what is real is what I feel.
Right. It's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're talking communication challenges, the next step is socialization. And if we're dealing with fear and constant reassurance, is there even a social aspect to the stage?
So for this stage, the socialization piece is really about how I interpret things in my world, okay? I don't have the ability necessarily to initiate engagement or interaction with other people. But what's important for you as a caregiver to know is that based on where I'm at in this journey, everything in my world I interpret through my senses. So I'm going to touch everything and everybody. Again, going back to that analogy of the toddler,
Absolutely.
everything is in my mouth. So when people get to this point in time in their disease process, they interpret their world through the palms of their hands, the inside of their mouth, the soles of their feet.
Wow.
So it's very sensory oriented. They're very tactile oriented. They're very noise sensitive. So everything is about how I experience it through those senses.
Wow. Okay. Task abilities. So what are they able to do then?
At this point in time, people are very limited on the ability they have to really complete tasks. Again, if you think about that toddler level, I will touch things, I will get into things, I will want to be independent, but how I can complete a task or be successful with that is very limited. So at this point in time, it's a lot about hands-on care and that constant physical intervention of care, and meeting a person's physical personal care needs is a constant companion for the caregiver. At this point in time, typically they aren't managed necessarily in terms of a toileting schedule. It becomes more about just frequent checks, keeping people clean and dry, constant intervention as a caregiver. This is when the physical care burden becomes the greatest for the caregiver. That is what is the most overwhelming challenge for someone at this point in time.
Is this the point where most people seek help or in living care?
Yeah.
Okay.
Typically two things drive seeking placement, either having somebody come into the home and assist or looking for outside placement. The two biggest concerns that are the most overwhelming responsibility for caregiver is safety and then the burden of physical care.
Let's talk a little bit about caregiver approach. So what do we need to know when it comes to that?
Okay. So again, remember these individuals at this stage have a very heightened startle reflex. So noise, chaos, traffic, strangers, things that are not familiar become a very frightening kind of situation for them, and frequently are big triggers for behavior. As we talked about earlier, if they are mobile, safety and security is a huge focus, is making sure that windows are secured, that doors are secured, that if you have a more than one level of your home, that stairways are secured. Because these people will move, and they will move impulsively without any thought or consideration for their safety or yours necessarily. Wow. They just have a need to move. You want to think about things that are soothing and calming. So their favorite music that is, one that they can connect to, the style that is calming and soothing. When you speak, to speak slowly and calmly, to keep the pitch of your voice low. These individuals are extremely sensitive to your mood and the mood of their climate. So how you act or react to them, that is going to set the mood and the tone for every interaction you have with these individuals. They are 3 times more sensitive to nonverbal communication and mood than they are to anything that you're ever going to try to say.
Your world is really thrown upside down.
Yeah, it is. It's a complete, total adjustment for a caregiver when individuals get to this stage, because the challenges are increased from a physical perspective. The drain and demand on you as a caregiver escalates. That's why it's so important for you to stay focused on taking care of yourself as well, and for soliciting and accepting help and support as you get through this process. I'm excited that one of our future sessions that we're going to talk about is specifically that, in terms of how do you help yourself as a caregiver.
And listen, the whole point of this segment is to really provide hope, right,
That's
to caregivers.
correct.
That let's really explain this dementia to you. Let's help you understand why this is happening and when it's happening, and tips and tricks to help you make it through it. But there's no doubt about this. Like, when you're talking about dementia, the word that keeps coming to my mind is cruel. Like, it really, to have someone grow in their life and create this environment, and then with this disease, it's just, you start kind of going back to where you started and almost feeling this trapped inside of trying to make sense of what's happening. You don't know what's happening. You're trying to figure it out. And then the next thing you know, you really can't remember anything. This cycle just feels so cruel to the individual going through it and the caregiver. And so, again, that's not to help make people lose hope. It's just to acknowledge, like, we see you, we get it. And it just, that's why we're here. This
is an extremely difficult journey for anyone to travel. I often share with people that somehow in God's infinite wisdom and grace and mercy, there comes a time for the person with the illness when they lose the understanding of what's happening. And it is more for the people surrounding that person that the difficulty continues to escalate. But for the individual with the illness, they kind of make that transition that, I'm okay, it's everybody else who has an issue, and they lose that understanding of what's happening to them and what they're losing. But for the caregiver, it is an ongoing challenge. It takes so much faith, so much hope. It's understanding that although this is a terminal illness that physically will end a person's life, in the time they have left, there is still hope for that person to have a good existence, a good quality of life. But it's about, the only way that can happen is for us to continue to understand what dementia is and what it is not, and how to rally around each other as caregivers to help us get through this journey. It takes a lot of faith, a lot of strength to make this journey. And everyone who has chosen to take this on needs to be commended. And, we are here for them. That's what this is all about.
Support for the Living Wisdom podcast is provided by InTouch Pharmaceuticals, committed to meeting the specialized pharmaceutical needs of their clients. Visit intouchpharma.com to learn more.